The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The Republican governor of Arizona, Jan Brewer, has done a lot of really bad things as governor. One of the few good things that she has done that we can point to has been not to fall to right-wing pressure to resist the Medicaid expansion as part of the Affordable Care Act in her state, but to actually participate in the Medicaid expansion. And we now are starting to get data about the results of that expansion, and the data predictably show that hospitals have started to save money as a result of this Medicaid expansion that took place. The uncompensated care at hospitals has decreased, and this has been driven by low-income and uninsured people who can't pay for their hospital bills now being covered by Medicaid. After Arizona back in 2011 removed childless adults from the Medicaid program, the amount of uncompensated care absolutely skyrocketed. And if you know anything about basic logic and reason, just because a hospital bills someone for care, if they are uninsured, the odds that you will ever collect for having provided that care are obviously lower than for someone who has insurance. And after expanding Medicaid as part of the Affordable Care Act in the first 4 months of 2014, according to a new report that we have, the uncompensated care at Arizona hospitals dropped by 31% compared to the same period in 2013. This helped the average operating margin of Arizona hospitals increase from 4% to 5.2% over the last year. That's more than a 25% increase in the operating margin. This is just obvious. I mean, I know that there are still people who don't understand the logic and the math behind this and the rationale. But of course, if you bill people who have no insurance, your actual collections will be lower than if you have the Medicaid expansion. And of course, if you have to then pass along to collection agencies, if we know how the entire medical billing bureaucracy decreases profits, this is a no-brainer, Lewis, and we still have many states that are refusing to expand Medicaid.
Right. And part of it is just in opposition to the current administration.
Right.
And I'm sure Brewer probably did not want to do this, but of course realized that it was the smart thing to do. It would be good for her state. And she probably had some pressure from, medical professionals and organizations in her state.
Well, the medical professionals and people thinking clearly in Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia, North Carolina, they have not been successful. And many hospitals have actually been forced to close there. It amazes me that there are people in these red states who think the reason they can't get care is because of something President Obama did, as opposed to because their Republican governor is just not participating in the Obamacare programs.
Right. It's, I guess you could say the same thing about voting for these people in the first place. It's just uneducated citizens.
Well, that's exactly my question. How can you get people to vote for their own best interests when they don't even know who is responsible for what they're complaining about in their own states? It's very tough to convince someone to vote out their Republican governor when they don't realize their Republican governor is the cause of the problem.
Right. I guess they just need to stop watching Fox News and the and corporate media.
Alex Jones has now referred to Michelle Obama, the First Lady, as the first tranny, and he went on a long rant explaining in quite specific detail why he questions that Michelle Obama is a woman. Now, I don't know whether this is just Alex Jones playing the character of Alex Jones on InfoWars, or whether this is really what Alex Jones thinks. We're going to play some of this for you. This was all in reaction to comments made by comedian, host, whatever, TV personality Joan Rivers, saying that Michelle is a tranny, okay? And those comments drew some controversy. But now Alex Jones is actually saying, you know what? I think there's significant evidence that Michelle Obama may actually be a man. Let's listen to a bit of Alex Jones explaining this.
Well, Joan Rivers talked about it in the last few days, and it's a big international news story. The question is, who is Michelle Obama? Is she really a woman? Is she a man? Now, I'm not drawing any conclusions here, but I know this. It's fair to question anything and everything this administration says, because I can't think of an administration in history that has been caught with such a perfect record of everything they say and do being a lie, being a fraud. Especially when every time I look at Michelle or Michael Obama, the first lady or the first tranny, every time I look at them, something doesn't look right. She doesn't look like any black woman or any woman I've ever known. She's got shoulders that are wider than a man's, which physiologically doesn't happen. Again, you can put 3 heads on a man's shoulders and only 2 heads on a woman's shoulders. That's a known anatomy. And then women generally have wider hips than men do. And you look at her arms and the rest of it, when she's standing straight on, she looks like no woman I have ever seen, except for people who have had different chromosomal disorders who choose to be a woman. And I've got
a lot of people increasingly are now wondering, could Alex Jones really be serious about this, or is he just playing a character? And I've told this story before. To sum it up, I once went to a talk radio conference here in New York City where Alex Jones was like a keynote speaker of some kind. And he went on this crazy conspiratorial rant in his speech. But then afterwards, I was in a very small group of people just chatting. It was Alex Jones and 2 or 3 other people and then me. And Alex Jones said, in a way that really seemed to be suggesting that this is just a character, do you guys think I went overboard? I thought about really freaking him out up there, but I figured it might be too much for this crowd, in a way that really made it seem like this is just a character he plays. In looking at the video, Lewis, is this real? Does he really think that Michelle Obama is a man?
I really don't know, but I just get the impression from everything he does and everything he says that he is a snake oil salesman. And so I think there's a good chance that it is just a show to make money.
I believe that Alex Jones is just clearly threatened by an accomplished, competent, and fit woman, and he's choosing to talk about her supposedly broad shoulders. When if this is really if this is a sincerely held belief of Alex Jones, I can only assume that he's incredibly intimidated by women like Michelle Obama.
Yeah, especially if he thinks they're men. I mean, come on, if every woman in the world who has broad shoulders and every woman in the world who has no hips is a man, all of a sudden, the population, the female population of the world just dropped by about 25%.
Right, yeah.
50% maybe.
I was under the impression that it was like 50.3% of the population that were women, but if you follow the logic of Alex Jones, it's actually, it's probably like 25%. Yeah, 75% of the population is male. The first person to legally buy recreational marijuana in Washington state was fired, but they have already been rehired. This is a really interesting story. At 2 p.m. on Tuesday, when recreational marijuana in Washington went on sale, Mike Boyer was the first person in Spokane at Greenleaf, a marijuana dispensary. He was captured on video by local TV station KXLY yelling, "Go Washington," as he purchased 4 grams of sour kush. The network then followed him home and filmed him smoking his legally purchased marijuana. The next day, his employer saw him on TV, called him in and said, "You need to, within 24 hours, submit to a drug test." The test came back positive for THC, and he was subsequently fired after working 12 years for them. So that's where the story may have stopped, but no, it went much further. The temp agency that was giving him 40 hours a week working in the auto auction industry, it's called True Blue Labor Ready, has told the Associated Press that actually they have given him his job back and will be paying him for the day off because he agreed that he was not to have THC in his system when he was working, but he was not scheduled to work that day. So actually, it was wrongful termination. He, of course, did nothing illegal since Washington legalized marijuana, but also he did nothing that violated the agreement he made, which is, when I am working, I will not be under the influence of THC. He has been subsequently rehired. So this is just one story, Lewis, but this is actually going to become a big thing because just because something is legalized does not mean that your employer has not told you have to sign saying you won't do that.
Right. It'll be a rocky road at first, I think, but you would have to assume that eventually the vast majority of employers will kind of warm up to this. I mean, come on, David, even the FBI and the CIA are starting to loosen their restrictions on this type of thing.
But the FBI and CIA are loosening their restrictions where you will not be disqualified from employment if you admit to, at some point in your past, having smoked marijuana. But that is very different. You know, like when you were 16, if you smoked weed, in the past, you would be disqualified from employment.
Oh, that's not true. Just for the purposes of recruiting, they are now trying to get rid of drug tests. They were
the tech guys, right? The computer analysis guys who the FBI was like, we're probably dissuading really good tech people because they smoke weed.
Yeah, and just because of that, they were revisiting their policy.
Wow. Okay, so well, maybe things are changing there. And in any case, we have to remember, you may have signed something with your employer that says, regardless of the law around marijuana, that you will not smoke marijuana. And this is definitely going to become a minefield as legalization continues. This is really, really bizarre. A Republican, in a recent speech condemning the Obama administration's new EPA carbon emission regulations, his name is Brandon Smith, he's of course a Republican, says that we have proof that humans are not affecting the climate on Earth because the temperature is the same on Earth as it is on Mars. And following his logic, if humans were having an impact on the temperature here, then the temperature would be far warmer than it is on Mars. Okay, I'll read you his quote. As you sit there in your chair with your data, we sit up here in ours with our data and our constituents and stuff behind us. I won't get into the debate about climate change, but I'll simply point out that I think in academia, we all agree that the temperature on Mars is exactly as it is here. Nobody will dispute that. Yet there are no coal mines on Mars. There are no factories on Mars that I am aware of. By the way, Smith happens to be the owner of a mining company called Mohawk Energy. So first of all, he's just wrong, right? If you just look up the temperature on the surface of Mars and the temperature on the surface of the Earth, according to NASA, the average Earth temperature is 57 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 138 degrees warmer than Mars's average of negative 81 degrees Fahrenheit. But let's forget that. These guys seem to forget that the atmosphere is completely different on each planet. The distance from the sun is completely different on every planet, and thus any comparison of the surface temperature on one planet versus another would neither prove nor disprove the long-term effect of human activities on Earth and the impact on the climate. This guy's just an idiot.
There are so many factors, and we just have to assume that his best interests are, of course, protecting his business and making as much money as possible, despite what it will do to the planet.
I was thinking that we've actually had a guest on this program compare Earth to other planets or heavenly bodies to make a case that, to make different cases that are not scientifically backed. I interviewed this guy named Mike McHugh several years ago, who's a Christian homeschooler, and he was trying to explain to me why he believes the moon is really, really young, that the moon hasn't been around nearly as long as science tells us. And he said, David, the amount of dirt, the thickness of the layer of dirt on the moon doesn't correspond logically to the amount on Earth given how long we are told the moon has been around. And it was the same exact explanation there. Well, number one, the moon has a completely different atmosphere or lack of one than does Earth. So any kind of comparison would be irrelevant. And by the way, you're not even considering the relative size of the moon compared to the Earth. This seems to be something that comes up time and time again, either when trying to disprove climate change or trying to prove religious-based theories on science and physics and astronomy, a complete disregard for basic differences between different planets and satellites.
And they seem to just, the naysayers seem to just latch on to one fact or one point that they always make. And it just, like you said, it doesn't make sense. I mean, there are so many factors at play here. This one fact that they pulled out of their rear ends just has no ground.
Speaking of facts that are pulled out of people's rear ends, in the next segment, Congressman Louis Gohmert will tell us what is his, he has a new theory for the proof of God, and he will give that to us next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com shows you how to unskew uncomfortable facts so that they will fit nicely into the conservative worldview. Learn all the latest ways to unskew reality at liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is Tiffany Johnson. Tiffany Johnson is a David Pakman Show member. Tiffany is voting with her dollars, and I encourage you to do the same. Support alternatives to homogenous corporate media and get a whole bunch of great member benefits while doing it. Members are the primary funding source for our show, and you can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. I often mention that you can also support our program with the Amazon.com shopping that you do. Just go to our website, davidpakman.com, and on the right side, you'll see a banner that goes to Amazon. Bookmark that link and use it whenever you shop, and Amazon sends us a kickback. A couple of interesting items purchased recently by our audience. One is this, Lewis. I don't know if you've heard of this. They have a nail formula that you can put on your nails. It doesn't necessarily paint your nails. It can just be completely clear with a matte finish that simply makes your nails taste really bitter. And it's a stop nail biting formula meant to just prevent you from biting your nails because the taste is so horrible when you put this stuff on your nails. I had never heard of such a thing.
Never heard of it, but it sounds like an easy way to try and break the habit. Sounds like a decent product.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's non-toxic. It claims to be, but we know that products don't always make completely accurate claims on the packaging. I've seen some people with really bad nails recently. On the subway, sometimes you have your hand, you're holding, the metal pole, and you'll see that someone's hands are near yours. And sometimes people's nails have been chewed down in a way, I don't even know how it's possible to chew your nails up that high. I don't know if you've ever seen what I'm describing, Lewis.
I don't think I have, no, but I don't know. That's a painful area right underneath the nail. I mean, it seems like you could really hurt yourself.
When I see it, I can only imagine that your nails are permanently in pain, but that your fingers are permanently in pain. But maybe if you do it all the time, it becomes numb or something. It loses sensitivity. I really have no idea. But I'm glad that that is not a bad habit that I have at this point. Also, a lot of purchases through our Amazon link for these external phone chargers that connect to your phone via USB. When Tom Hartman and I did a speaking gig recently, at a certain point he pulled out, it looked like a mini flashlight almost. And he just connected it to his phone, and he explained that flashlight-like device contains 1 or 2 full charges for his phone, and he can pull it out at any time if your phone's running low on battery. Very, very interesting devices, and it really shows that there's a huge desire to drastically increase battery life for these more and more advanced devices that we have. And I think we're probably just a few years away from significantly longer battery lives on a lot of personal products.
Yeah, we do need a breakthrough because the company that has that breakthrough is going to be rewarded heavily. So,
and you reject you don't agree with that, right? Because you think the entire patent system is completely fraudulent and bogus.
Well, they'll still be the first to produce it and get it out there, David, and they will at least have a stranglehold on the market for probably a few years.
Officials at a Kentucky church said this week that they knew their pastor was a registered sex offender when they hired him. And now he is facing even more charges for allegedly, repeatedly raping a 14-year-old member of the congregation. The Gallatin Police Department in Kentucky said in a statement that 46-year-old Pastor Roy Neal Yoakum had been arrested on charges of aggravated statutory rape, sexual battery by an authority figure, statutory rape by an authority figure, and fugitive from justice, according to the Tennessean. Yoakum is accused of sexually assaulting a 14-year-old boy once inside New Gospel Outreach Church in Scottsville, Kentucky, and once at his own home in Gallatin, Tennessee. The pastor was required to register as a sex offender, a violent sex offender, after being found guilty back in 2005 of abusing an 8-year-old boy in Kentucky. So why did the church hire Yoakum? Well, the church interim pastor, Stephen Bratcher, told WZTV that he was shocked to hear of the allegations, that the church did know he was a registered sex offender, but that the church determined that the previous allegations of sexual assault were false, going on to say, about the legality, the troopers over at the Bowling Green Post said that they contacted the sex offenders branch and said there's nothing illegal about it. I don't even understand what that means. If he was convicted, what does that mean? There's nothing illegal about hiring a sex offender? And then they said, we're firm believers. This is the key line. We're firm believers in the Bible. So if God's forgiven you, then we're in no position to treat you otherwise. How do you check with God to find out if he has forgiven someone that is a prospective hire at your place of work? How do you check with God?
You don't, David. The person has to check with God. And clearly God told this guy that he was forgiven. He told the church, and the church believed it.
The next time, I would suggest the church get a written notice. They should get a permission slip from God just to be sure.
Signed.
Yeah, they need it to be signed. Kids are unnecessarily dying from lack of treatment because of religion. Kids are dying pastors are dying from snake bites. They believe God wants them to handle these snakes. Kids are being raped by pedophiles who have been forgiven by God, so they're okay to hire at another church. At some point, these religious zealots need to learn that just because they've concocted some interpretation of a so-called religious text doesn't mean that there's any connection to reality and that you'll be spared from the real-world consequences of these incredibly ridiculous decisions.
Unfortunately, that book is their reality. So, David, you're not going to see any changes.
As a side note, WSMV reported that in 2011, a church pastor, a previous pastor of this same church, Billy Minix, was charged with embezzling $300,000. Interesting church. I would stop my tithes immediately if I were you. Louis Gohmert, Republican congressman from Texas, who often makes Sarah Palin sound intelligent and eloquent, says that he has proven that God exists. Well, actually, not he, but a friend of his from Nacogdoches, Texas, has proven that God exists. Here's what he had to say at the Celebrate America event. It is a revival effort organized by the Holy Laughter pioneer Rodney Howard Brown. Here is Louis Gohmert quoting his friend from Nacogdoches, explaining how we know God exists.
There was an old gentleman from East Texas, from Nacogdoches, and Bob Murphy used to say, I feel so sorry for atheists. I do. He said, think about it. No matter how smart they think they are, an atheist has to admit that he believes the equation nobody plus nothing equals everything. He says, how embarrassing for an intellectual to have to say, yeah, I believe that. Nobody plus nothing equals everything. Well, you couldn't get everything unless there was something that was the creator of everything. And that's the Lord we know.
Once again, Congressman Louis Gohmert demonstrating the breathtaking depth of his intellect. There really is this common refrain from creationists that, hey, atheists just think and scientists just think that nothing created everything, and that simply doesn't make sense. Of course, this idea falsely assumes many premises that we have no proof of for what we even call a creation, right? And there's no way to talk sense into these guys. I've had this conversation with creationists like Ray Comfort and the guy who thought that the Noah's Ark story was literally true. There is this whole other set of assumptions that they make when they talk about a, quote, creation that have not even been proven to be true.
Right. It's all assumptions. It's all just a book that was written by men that they think proves everything. But that's the thing. That's where the laziness comes into play. It's just very easy and convenient to have this book and say you have all the answers because of it. You don't need to do any research. You don't need to do any testing or observation or hypothesizing or theorizing. It's all right there.
Who created the creator in the mind of the friend of Louis Gohmert? I don't know. I don't know what he would say about that. I have a different equation, which applies very specifically to Louis Gohmert. Gerrymandering plus a broken campaign finance system equals people like Louis Gohmert holding elected office in this country. I think that my equation is much more accurate than Louis Gohmert's friends.
Just add in religious fundamentalism to your equation too, and it's a recipe for success.
What's happening with the 2014 election? What's happening with the lawsuit against President Obama? Bill Scher will join us next to talk about this. Make sure to follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/David Pakman Show, and you can follow me on Twitter twitter.com/dpacman. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Joining me today is Bill Scher. He is senior writer for Campaign for America's Future. Bill, let's talk a little bit about the 2014 election. What does it look like first in the Senate? Then we'll talk about the House. We hear talk of if and when Republicans take over control of the Senate, they will be able to do this long list of stuff. How likely is it that that takeover will take place?
Well, I think most of the models now suggest that Republicans have a good shot at taking the Senate. It's just not a lock. It's too early to make any judgments based on polling. Even some of the models that you see out there, for example, the one at the Washington Post explicitly says we're not even incorporating polling into our model yet. We're just using past history and demographics to make our initial predictions. But polling later on will then become more influential in our predictions. You have to keep in mind that we're in the summer. We are in a relatively, I'd say, still political picture. There's not necessarily a huge issue that is dominating the midterm campaign. And in that kind of circumstance, you would see a lot of incumbents get returned to office, or in the case of the Senate, where you have a lot of Democrats who are incumbents but running in right-leaning states in a midterm election, 6-year presidential term, Republican base more energized than Democratic base. That definitely is not a good recipe for Democrats. But what we don't know going into the fall is some issue going to arise? We have certain issues that are beginning to bubble up to the surface. We have the Hobby Lobby case, which is animating a lot of women voters. We have immigration issues that might animate Latino voters. So there's a lot of wild cards out there that sort of make me hesitant to say you can make a really firm prediction, this far out.
And then how about in the House? How are things looking there?
Well, certainly, almost every observer is going to say Republicans are going to keep the House. But I would suggest to you that there is a path for Democrats here. I wouldn't call it a high probability path. But going back to immigration here, you have 19 House districts that a polling firm known as Latino Decision said have a Latino population that is of enough significance that they could, if not outright decide a House race, could strongly influence a House race in those districts. An overlap between those 19 and what your main congressional handicappers, Stu Rothenberg, Charlie Cook, Larry Sabato, those folks say we consider these to be competitive races. They may not be toss-up races. They might be lean Republican or even likely Republican, but competitive enough that there is a chance for Democrats to take it. So you have 19 races where Latinos could be a factor, and Obama's going to have this executive order, which is going to give deportation relief probably around Labor Day, right at the beginning of the fall election campaign season. And if you have Republicans outright chastising the president as abusing his executive authority, you might have John Boehner incorporating immigration into this proposed lawsuit. If that becomes a real above-the-fold issue that really brings out the Latino vote, you might see the beginnings of a wave, which we don't see today. But if that wave occurs in the fall, you might see a real upset.
You talked about the lawsuit. I want to get to that, into the impeachment thing. But before we talk about that, is your sense that the Republican fake scandal, so we're talking about the focus on Benghazi while having ignored 12 Benghazis under George W. Bush, the IRS so-called scandal, the Bo Bergdahl so-called scandal, et cetera, are these actually activating the Republican base, or are they not really effective in stimulating the voters?
I don't think any one of those issues is a main driver for Republicans now. their animosity towards Obama has been building up for a very long time. And now you have this narrative of abuse of executive power, which goes beyond any single issue because they've taken a whole myriad of issues. You read the Sarah Palin call for impeachment. It's an utter mishmash.
Yeah.
So to an outsider looking at it, you'd say, who is this crazy person who let her out of her cell? But if you are a Republican who has already been inoculated into that theory, you look past the bizarre sentence structure and you intrinsically get what she's saying. So that's sort of baked in the cake already. They're going to show up.
Yeah.
But just to circle back to what I was saying before, Democrats only need 17 net wins, 17 seats gain in the House to take it over. Now, the reason why most folks say it's not going to happen is that there's not that many seats on the table. And that's not just a gerrymandering issue. There's just a general sorting that's going on in the country where people have gravitated to live in places with like-minded people. That on top of some of the gerrymandering means you have a lot of safe seats. So Democrats would have to run the table if they were to take it over. But a path exists. The question is, can you get the Democratic base animated in a way that outpaces the natural energizing that's happening on the right now?
Okay, so then let's get to the topic of your Politico article, which is impeachment and the lawsuit against President Obama for his alleged misuse of executive orders. When this lawsuit first surfaced, John Boehner said, the idea here is not to eventually impeach President Obama. Now, of course, it was abundantly clear to me that if the lawsuit were successful, it would be used as a pretext to talk about impeachment. What is your sense right now of whether the entire discussion of impeachment is being handled well or not by John Boehner? Has he created a situation where the discussion around the lawsuit and impeachment could help Republicans, or could it backfire?
Well, I think Boehner has completely mishandled this. And as I mentioned in my article on Politico, I'm not a Boehner basher. I think he's actually been very deft up until this point at trying to contain the Tea Party faction and preventing it from driving Republicans off the cliff.
Agree.
He at the start of 2013, he managed to get through legislation to expand the Violence Against Women Act to cover gays and to provide Hurricane Sandy relief over the objections of the Tea Party. He knew those would be hot button subjects, and the Tea Party killed those. There was a sleeper issue of the Medicare doc fix, where doctors are going to get steep cuts to their reimbursements if Congress didn't act. Conservatives didn't want to do it because they thought the offsets were going to be gimmicks. Boehner totally snowed them by scheduling a voice vote and not telling them, and sliding the bill through without them having a chance to object. I mean, that's pretty raw Machiavellian politics, but it did the job. So that's how, and of course, the whole shutdown business, he lets the shutdown go through for a few days, but he pulls the plug on it before we have a debt default. So he's done all these things to try to keep the Tea Party at bay, but then dealing with immigration reform, his biggest headache throughout these 2 years, back in February, realizing his attempt to get Republicans on record to support a form of legalization. It wasn't flying with his caucus. He didn't have the political courage to take them head on. So he says in February, the problem here is the president because we don't trust him to faithfully execute the laws. So in February, he lays down the predicate for what would be impeachment. And of course, Boehner doesn't want impeachment. Again, he does not want a crazy Tea Party extremist issue to be the focal point of the midterms. He knows that is a huge risk to not only the chance to take over the Senate, but perhaps his own control of the House. He wants to keep the political waters still. He thought he could cut that off at the pass by offering a lawsuit at the end of the day and not get it spill over into impeachment. But the problem is the rationales are the same. So once you put that on the table, the calls for impeachment invariably come out. Now, I can't predict to you here that it will necessarily mean it's all everybody's talking about come September or October, but it's definitely a risk, especially when someone like Sarah Palin grabs the microphone. As much of a laughingstock as she still tries media coverage. You even have a case in Iowa right now where the Republican nominee who was touting impeachment in the primary to primary voters, the general election voters hadn't noticed yet, Now Palin speaks up. Reporters dig up her past comments. Now she flip-flops on the subject. Will that be an issue for her come election day? Those are the kinds of issues that Boehner has to worry that he has created because he couldn't just deal with immigration reform like a responsible congressperson, and he had to play political games.
All right, we're going to continue following the lawsuit. We will continue covering calls for impeachment based on violating a specific law, or in Sarah Palin's case, simply based on emotion and the fact that she seems to think it is time for impeachment. We've been speaking with Bill Scher. He is senior writer for Campaign for America's Future. Bill, great to talk to you as always.
Same to you. Take care.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've talked a little bit about this new television channel, Newsmax, the extreme right-wing TV channel. There's a guy named Steve Maltzberg who has one of the shows there, and he had Republican Congressman Steve King on the program, and they were talking about immigration. And there have been so many just false statements around President Obama and the border. We, of course, heard from Sarah Palin on last week's programs that she is ready, she is calling for President Obama's impeachment simply for the fact that he's abiding by a law related to Central American child immigration to the U.S. that was signed into law by George W. Bush. That didn't make much sense. This comment from Congressman Steve King makes maybe even less sense than that, saying that the country may soon be overrun by billions with a B of undocumented immigrants. Listen to what Steve King had to say to Steve Maltzberg.
This is a presidential caused crisis. He has the resources to solve the problem. If he's not going to close that border, then I'm calling upon the border governors to call up their National Guard, order their National Guard to the border. They're the commanders-in-chief of their National Guard. Seal the border. And this president's not going to. Think what 2.5 years of President Obama's sanctuary nation turns into. It won't be any longer the question of whether we can deport 11 million people. It will be tens of millions more, and the question will be how many billion people can we let into the United States under the circumstances that he has. And I say that term billion, I didn't just pull it out of the air. There's 7 billion people on the planet, and over half of them would like to be in America.
First of all, I would think Steve King would be cheering this, because if that were the case, then the U.S. could be bigger than China, and usually these right-wingers just want to be first on every list, as that the U.S. should be first on every list, regardless of whether it's a good list, a bad list, or an indifferent one. But he's actually represented the epitome, the microcosm of the exaggerated, self-aggrandizing, delusions of grandeur view that is stereotypically the dumb American view around the country, which is the U.S. is amazing, everyone wants to have and be in the U.S., but they suck. So we have to keep them out. That's essentially the undertone of what Steve King is saying to Steve Maltzberg.
Right. And of course, when billions of undocumented immigrants flood into your country, David, it would just destroy the country because there are billions of them and they're all willing to work for 1 cent an hour.
Right. And by the way, we actually have data to specifically disprove what Steve King says. Gallup did a study a couple of years ago where they looked around the world to evaluate and quantify what percentage of people on this planet want to move to a different country. And what they found is that about 16% of the world's adults want to move to another country permanently if given the chance. Now, of those 16%, how many would choose the United States? They found that in the complete pie-in-the-sky optimum situation where they could go to the U.S. with absolutely no cost, receive citizenship, etc., 165 million people would choose to go to the U.S. Not quite the billions that Steve King is talking about. We actually have data. I love it when Republicans just say whatever they think sounds good to scare people. Billions of people will invade our country. And we have very specific data that says actually, in the greatest case scenario, there's 165 million people that would move to the U.S.
Right. Does anyone believe these people when they start throwing numbers around like this? Like the entire population of China and India is going to flood into the United States. And it will, what is our current population? I mean, come on.
330 million. Yeah.
Yeah. Ridiculous.
Nephi sent us this story about Virginia police who want to photograph a teenager's erect penis. They've obtained a search warrant, Virginia police have, to photograph the erect penis of a 17-year-old facing felony child porn charges for sexting an explicit video to his 15-year-old girlfriend, according to the boy's lawyer. Police are saying if the boy doesn't cooperate by allowing erect pictures to be taken of him, he will be brought to a hospital and will receive a medically induced erection via an injection into his penis. The long and short of it is police have all, and that's maybe not the best term to use, Lewis. That was a completely unintended pun. I didn't even think of that. Police have already taken flaccid pictures of the individual, but I guess to further their case, they need to be able to compare his erect penis to the erect penis in the video that was sent to establish beyond any reasonable doubt that it was indeed this individual 17-year-old's penis that was sent to the 15-year-old. What do you think about this, Lewis?
Can you think of anything more ridiculous? I mean, first of all, it's Virginia, so I'm not surprised that this is happening. But do we really need to be going after a couple with this 2-year difference? I mean, I know the law is the law.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think people might agree with me that this is a bit ridiculous.
Oh, Lewis, I assume most of our audience will agree with you. These child porn laws have been written in such a way, the same way that a lot of internet-related law has been written, that doesn't really take into consideration how technology is actually used. And when we think about child porn law, we're not thinking about, at least I'm not, and no logical person that I've talked to is thinking about 17-year-olds and 15-year-olds. The idea of criminalizing the activities of 17-year-olds through child porn laws is really not what should be the goal of society here. This is a completely half-cocked interpretation of the law, Lewis, if I may, and I really hope that the police case falls totally flaccid.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, David, now, they want to make their own child porn while trying to prosecute for child porn. It's completely insane.
That's a good point. Yeah, they're essentially creating more child porn by trying to, mandatory erections for 17-year-olds should not be a part of enforcing sensible child porn law. Let's go to your, yeah, go ahead.
This was authorized, David. Yeah. But, it's incredible.
Let's go to your voicemails. 219-2-DAVID-P. Call anytime. Here's a voicemail.
Man, you guys got a really good show. I enjoy watching it a lot. But I totally disagree with that Dr. Angelo guy. War is not part of the human condition. That's something conservatives like to think because that's part of their condition. But it's not part of the rest of us. Okay? It's not. And they've done study after study has proven it. We're hardwired for social democracy. Okay? We're hardwired to help people.
I completely agree. And when people say, we often have this conversation when we talk about homophobia, racism, etc. There's nothing natural about any of those things. Those are learned behaviors. Those are learned points of view. And I think that the idea that we're hardwired for war also is not accurate. And just because you can point to war pervading human history for as long as we have recorded history, that is not evidence that humans by their nature are hardwired for war. Very, very interesting voicemail. On today's bonus show, the Federal Trade Commission sues Amazon. Members of Congress declare immunity from an insider trading. What? A problem,
probe.
Lewis?
A probe?
Oh, an insider trading probe. And ISIS tells FIFA cancel the World Cup in Qatar. I happen to agree with ISIS on this one thing. Join us on today's bonus show, davidpakman.com/membership. Talk to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.